Okay, so get this. We are diving into this massive opposition research file on JD Vance. Vance, hillbilly elegy guy, now senator.
Right.
We're talking a 269-page document. It's like someone sat down and said, let's find every single thing that JD Vance has ever said or done that could raise an eyebrow.
Yeah. Opposition research, it's a fascinating thing because it is designed to be one-sided.
Right.
But I think what's interesting about it is that it can really uncover the inconsistencies in a public figure's narrative, right? You're forced to kind of look beyond the carefully crafted image.
And let me tell you, there are some contradictions here. Like, seriously, this document is jam-packed with instances where Vance seems to completely contradict his own past statements.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to, you guessed it, Donald Trump.
Yeah, and that's one of the big themes throughout this entire document is they really try to map his evolution from, never Trumper, who called some of Trump's policies, and I quote, immoral to absurd.
Wow.
To, very much a staunch Trump supporter during his Senate run.
Yeah, there's this one tweet from 2016 that I just have to bring up because it's like the document really highlights it, and it's a doozy. So Vance tweets this: what percentage of the American population has real Donald Trump sexually assaulted? And yet, later on, he defends Trump during the Access Hollywood tape scandal. Like, what is going on there?
Yeah, it's a head scratcher. And I mean, the document doesn't pretend to offer us like a definitive explanation, but they're very clearly trying to highlight this really, really drastic shift and suggest that, maybe Vance's change of heart wasn't so much a genuine evolution of his beliefs, but more of a calculated move for political gain.
It makes you think, right? And speaking of calculated moves, this document really digs into Vance's relationship with big-time tech investors like Peter Thiel.
Right.
And this is while he's out there on his soapbox criticizing big tech. It's a bit like biting the hand that feeds you, wouldn't you say?
It is. And they do a really good job of kind of weaving this subtle narrative throughout, highlighting, for example, Vance's work with Thiel's investment firm, Naria Capital.
Right.
Which is interesting considering Vance's very public stance against the influence of big tech.
Yeah.
So they're clearly drawing that connection and aiming to raise questions about his sincerity there.
Yeah, and it's not just Thiel, right? So we've got Vance's nonprofit, Our Ohio Renewal. He founds this thing to like tackle social issues in Ohio.
Yeah, it's supposed to be this big give back to his roots.
Exactly.
Right. So you would think, big charity doing great things. Well, they pull some interesting information from the 990s, from the tax filings for Our Ohio Renewal. And in 2017, 96.4% of their fundraising went to, get this, staff salaries and overhead.
Wow.
$0 went to charitable activities or grants.
Zero.
Zero.
That does not scream champion of the people, does it?
No.
Like, come on.
Not really. They want us to question if the actions match the rhetoric.
Exactly. And it's not the only thing, right?
Yeah.
His stance on voter fraud also kind of raises some eyebrows in this thing.
It does.
Because initially he's like, I don't see the evidence when it came to Trump's claims of all the fraud back in 2016.
Right.
And then fast forward to 2020, he's singing a different tune. Right.
A different tune.
Echoing those same claims.
Yeah, it's pretty dramatic. And again, they do this thing where they don't come out and say, oh, this is hypocritical.
Right.
But they present the information in a way that almost encourages you to connect the dots yourself.
Okay, so maybe his views on Trump, on voter fraud are kind of up for debate. People evolve.
Yeah.
Right? But his economic beliefs, like those must be more consistent, right? Because he's built this whole image around being a champion for the working class.
You would think, and this is where they, I think, really start to kind of dig into the nuances of his past statements. And they unearth instances where his views seem to really clash with his current conservative image.
Like, give me an example. What are we talking about?
So, for example, he once said that white working class voters could actually benefit from some Democrat economic policies.
Oh, wow.
Which is not exactly a soundbite that you would expect from, a Republican senator.
Right. That's a big one.
Yeah.
So he's criticizing free trade. He's acknowledging some, potential benefits of Democrat policies. This is not the picture I think a lot of people have in their heads.
No, it's not. And he's also been very critical of the GOP itself for, in his words, prioritizing corporate interests over those of working families.
Interesting.
Which, again, is a stance that you more typically hear from, the more progressive side of the aisle.
It's like he's almost trying to like cherry pick from both sides.
Yeah.
Which makes you wonder, like, who is he really trying to appeal to here?
That's the question. Are you really genuinely trying to find solutions that work for everyone? Or are you very carefully crafting a persona that is designed to appeal to, the broadest possible base? And it's especially interesting when you look at his stance on social programs, right? Because that's a big one.
Right. Well, he wants to reduce government spending. He's with the Republicans on that.
Yeah, he does now. But this document, they dug up this blog post from 2010 where he actually argued for significant cuts to both Social Security and Medicare.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's a third rail.
It's a third rail. And they make sure to highlight that this stance, especially at the time, completely contradicted, even the typical Republican platform. And, could very easily alienate a huge portion of the electorate.
Yeah, you don't touch Social Security, especially if you want to get those older voters on your side.
Exactly.
So okay, we've got the flip-flopping, the statements on Trump. We've got the ties to big tech while criticizing big tech. We've got this history of supporting cuts to social programs. This JD Vance deep dive is already getting very juicy.
And we're just getting started. I mean, they go even deeper.
Oh no.
They get into his foreign policy positions, his connections to other, shall we say, interesting figures. They even get into like the nitty gritty of his Senate campaign finances.
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's keep going.
Yeah.
We're seeing this pattern, right, with Vance. Like he's presenting this one image, but then his like past actions or statements, they suggest something totally different. Makes you wonder if this was like a deliberate strategy, especially during his Senate campaign.
Well, the document definitely seems to think so. They really dig into his campaign finances and highlight, the millions of dollars that he received in contributions, including some from sources that seem, let's just say, a little bit at odds with his populist message.
You mean like those big corporations and wealthy donors he always talks about?
The very same.
But that totally clashes with this whole fighting for the working class image that he's got going on.
Exactly. And they even list out, some of his biggest donors, and it reads like a who's who of, the people and industries that he claims to be against. Peter Thiel, the Koch brothers, even PACs that are associated with, big tech companies.
It's one thing to, talk the talk.
Right.
But when the campaigns, like, coffers are being filled by the very entities you're out there criticizing, it makes you wonder, like, where do your loyalties really lie?
It does make you wonder about the compromises that are being made, kind of behind closed doors. And speaking of contradictions, the document also gets into Vance's foreign policy positions, specifically his stance on Ukraine.
Oh, yeah, right. He's been one of the most vocal critics of U.S. aid to Ukraine, like even calling for a complete halt to the funding. And he frames it as like, we need to prioritize America's needs.
Right.
But this document seems to imply that there might be another motive there.
Yeah, they highlight this memo that Vance actually circulated in Congress, arguing that continued aid to Ukraine could actually give Democrats, ammunition to try and impeach Trump again.
Wait, so they're saying that his stance on Ukraine, his opposition to the aid, it's more about protecting Trump than like some deeply held belief he has about foreign policy.
That's a narrative that they're pushing.
Wow.
They also highlight his how can I put it, his skepticism of Zelensky, and point out all these instances where he's retweeted posts that, call into question Zelensky's image as, this heroic figure, which is, it's a bit of a risky strategy, right? Especially given, how politically charged that whole situation is.
Yeah, it does seem very much geared towards, that America First crowd,
yeah.
But also kind of risks alienating all the people who see support for Ukraine as like crucial,
right?
Especially right now. So it's a delicate dance.
It is.
But, going back to this idea of Vance, maybe changing his tune for political reasons, is there anything else in this document that points to that?
Well, there's a whole section on his connections to other influential figures, shall we say, some of whom hold very, very different political views than what Vance is, espousing now.
Oh, you mean like Steve Case? We talked about Peter Thiel, but like Case he's a whole other ballgame.
He is. So they point out that Vance actually worked for Case's investment firm, Revolution, and even participated in Case's Rise of the Rest initiative,
right? Which,
by the way, is backed by this like laundry list of very wealthy tech investors.
Which, again, seems a little, contradictory given his whole crusade against, big tech.
A little bit. And here's where it gets even juicier. So Case was a very, very vocal supporter of Hillary Clinton back in 2016.
Okay.
And has been very critical of a lot of Trump's policies, particularly on immigration.
Hold on. So Vance is out here working for someone who is openly opposed to the very candidate that he ends up supporting.
That's correct. And they do not let us forget that. They actually mention how, Case is publicly criticizing Trump's policies, even at one point calling for a boycott of Trump's hotels while Vance is still working for him.
Wow. You can't make this stuff up. That's got to be awkward. Like, did Vance ever actually address that seeming conflict of interest?
The document doesn't mention any public statements from Vance on that particular issue, which, kind of speaks volumes.
Well, yeah, it does seem a lot easier to like rail against, quote unquote elites when you're not like actively taking a paycheck from one.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And then they take it one step further because they highlight Case's involvement in this like massive tourism project in Saudi Arabia funded by the Saudi government, which, as we all know, doesn't exactly have the cleanest human rights record.
I see where you're going with this. So they're trying to link Vance, like however indirectly, to a regime that is, that is known for human rights abuses.
Exactly. Which is, it's a bold move. And it really raises these questions about, the company that Vance keeps and whether those associations really align with, his stated values.
It's like they're saying, look at all these connections. Do you really know who JD Vance is?
Yeah, that is the question that they keep coming back to. And it's a question that I think becomes even more compelling as we, get further into this document and uncover even more about his past, about his journey to becoming a U.S. senator.
Okay, I need to know more. Like, what else is in this treasure trove of opposition research?
Well, there's this really fascinating section that digs into his life before politics.
Okay.
His writings, his early career choices, even some personal anecdotes that paint, frankly, a very, very different picture of the man that we see, kind of on the political stage today.
This just keeps getting more and more interesting. Tell me about it. So we've spent all this time, right, really unpacking all these contradictions, all these like eyebrow-raising moments from Vance's past. But it feels like this document, it's not just about like, digging up dirt for the sake of it. It's trying to get us to ask, like, how do all these inconsistencies, how do they square with the image that he's presenting, especially to those working class voters that he claims to represent?
Right. Like, is he authentically connected to those voters? Or is he kind of using their struggles to fuel his own ambition?
Yeah, and they raise some really, really interesting points in here. Like, how do you reconcile, his lifestyle?
Right.
Which is, let's be honest, it's a pretty comfortable lifestyle.
Right.
He's got ties to all these wealthy investors, but then his message is, I'm a champion for, the forgotten man.
Yeah.
It feels like a disconnect.
It does. And they highlight that tension like a lot. They talk about, his multi-million-dollar home in D.C., his wife's, very prestigious job at this law firm that often represents, big corporate interests. Like, it's all in there to make you question, like, does he really understand, on a fundamental level, the struggles of the people that he's claiming to represent?
It's one thing to write a book about it.
Right.
But it's another thing to actually, like, live it. And yet he still won. So, like, how do you explain that?
Well, and this is where I think things get really, really interesting. Because they acknowledge, even with all of this, all these potential vulnerabilities, they acknowledge that he has, a certain charisma, like a knack for connecting with voters on a very like visceral, emotional level.
It's a hillbilly elegy appeal, right?
Exactly.
It's like this relatable story.
Yep. Overcoming adversity, achieving the American dream.
Right.
And he's very carefully positioned himself as this outsider.
Right.
Someone who gets it because he's lived it.
Yeah.
And it's powerful, right? That's a powerful narrative.
Yeah.
And it resonates with people who feel like the system has failed them.
And let's be real, there are a lot of people feeling that way right now.
A lot.
Like disillusion with both parties.
Yeah.
They're just looking for someone who speaks their language, someone who's like, one of us.
Exactly. And Vance has really masterfully, I think, tapped into that. He's framed himself as the anti-establishment candidate, the guy who's not afraid to speak truth to power, even if that means going against his own party.
So it's less about the actual policies, the nitty-gritty. It's more about capturing like a feeling.
Yeah.
This kind of shared frustration with the way things are.
It's one of the key insights, I think, of this whole document is that it kind of reminds us that elections are not always won on, logic and policy details. Emotion is huge.
Huge, yeah.
And Vance has proven to be very, very good at tapping into that.
Yeah. It makes you think about like the power of storytelling in politics. Right?
Okay.
Like he's crafted this narrative, and whether you agree with his politics or not, you can't deny that it's effective.
Yeah, and it's what makes him, I think, such a fascinating figure. He's complex, he's contradictory, and ultimately, I think, a reflection of kind of the anxieties and the desires of a very specific segment of the American electorate.
So where does this leave us? What are we supposed to make of JD Vance after this like deep dive into all the contradictions, the complexities? Who is this guy?
I mean, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think honestly, I think they want us to sit with that question. It's not about coming to some hard definitive conclusion about who he is, what he stands for. It's more about just recognizing the complexities of the man himself and the political landscape that he's a part of.
It's about understanding that things aren't always black and white. People contain multitudes. They can hold these views that seem contradictory, but in their heads it makes sense. And also that political motivations are often not very straightforward.
Rarely straightforward. And I think as you continue to follow not just his career, but really any political figure's career, go into it with that understanding. Don't just accept what you see on the surface. Dig a little deeper. Ask questions. And be wary of anyone who's offering really easy answers or claims to have all the solutions.
Because the truth is always much messier.
Yeah.
Much more nuanced. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about when it comes to JD Vance, but I think it's also given us a good framework for how we should be engaging with politics more broadly.
Yeah, be a discerning consumer of information, right?
Right.
Question your assumptions and approach these really complex issues with a healthy dose of skepticism, but also with the willingness to really engage with lots of different perspectives.
Well said. On that note, we will leave you to ponder JD Vance and all of his contradictions and the forces that shape this crazy thing we call politics. This has been the deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and as always, stay curious.